Welcome to this Introduction to Public Finance video. What we are going to look at in this video is first, we are going to have a look at the size of government and how it relates to the economy. We are going to look at receipts and expenditure trends in the United States, but I will also provide an international perspective, basically comparing other countries to the United States. Next, we are going to have a general course overview about the videos and the topics that will be covered throughout. First, we are going to have a look at the role of government in the economy, in the sense why and how does the government intervene in the economy. Then we are going to talk about budgets and budgeting. Here we are going to make the difference between what are called recurrent budgets and capital budgets. Then we are going to have a look at government revenue. This is going to involve a look at the various tax mechanisms. And finally, we are going to have a look at debt management as well as forecasting. At the end of this lecture, I will also provide an overview about the data sources where you can get up-to-date and official data that you can use throughout this class as well as after this class. Now let us have a look at the federal government first. Before we start talking about the taxes and revenues by the federal government, we are going to have a look at what gross domestic product means. Here I have the definition of GDP that is provided by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And basically it says that the GDP is the value of the goods and services produced in the United States. Of course, this is also valid for other countries. Now, the GDP is a very important economic indicator because the economic growth or the changes in the GDP are used to determine whether the economy is doing well or whether the economy is actually in a recession. The National Bureau of Economic Research states that we view real GDP as the single best measure of aggregate economic activity. They use this to determine whether the economy is in a recession, and hence they are placing significant weight on the estimates of real GDP that is issued by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Now, let us have a look at the federal government in a nutshell. The federal government has outlays in the sense that expenditures, and there is also government revenue. Now, note that the outlays are categorized between what are called discretionary outlays, for example, defense spending, and non-discretionary outlays like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. In this class, we are going to go in big detail about the difference between the two, but think about that the discretionary outlays actually have to go what is called an appropriation bill. Basically, Congress has to decide in conjunction with the White House, has to decide of how much to spend on certain items. Non-discretionary outlays do not have to go through an appropriation bill. The government revenue in 2022 was about $4.9 trillion. You can see that a large chunk of this money is coming from individual income taxes, about $2.6 trillion, but there are also payroll taxes such as Social Security, which make up $1.5 trillion. The federal government also has expenditures, and the mandatory spending this is what we have about, for example, this is equivalent to non-discretionary outlays, is about $4.1 trillion, and the discretionary spending is about $1.7 trillion. We will also see that the government has debt, and like with any other debt, there are interests due. And in 2022, the federal government has spent about $475 billion on interest payments. Now, In this graph, I have plotted the outlays and the receipts in the same graph and how they have evolved over time. Note that here we are going to talk about real expenditures and receipts, and the real means that this has been corrected for inflation. As you can see, the outlays or the expenditure and the receipts have significantly increased over time. And you can also see that there are certain spikes. For example, the 2008 recession, you can see that here the economy or the federal government has put significant resources at the disposal of the economy. And then, of course, we also see the spike after or during the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. Now note that all the data underlying those graphs are from the Federal Reserve Economic Data Service, and you also have the links to those particular time series in the slides. Now, although this seems to be a large increase, if we compare the government expenditures in relation to GDP, or the value or the size of the economy, then you see that this has been relatively stable over time. Here, of course, you have the war effort with the Second World War. Again, here you have the 2008 recession, and here you have the expenditure associated with COVID-19. You can see that the outlays or the expenditures and receipts are approximately 20% of GDP. What this also means is that the US government is a big player when it comes to the economy. Okay? The blue line is basically the surplus or the deficit. Think about this as the receipts minus the expenditures. And you can see that it was only around the 2000 where there was actually a surplus, and before as well as after there's a considerable deficit. Now, I mentioned before that you have this deficit, and if you have a deficit over multiple years, you are accumulating debt. Now, the question is, who is holding this debt? Here, I have listed the top 10 countries in terms of debt holdings that are holders of treasury securities. You can see that, for example, you have Japan that holds about $1.1 trillion of US debt. Note that I have also included the gross domestic product of the countries holding the debt. And you can see that for some of those countries, there is a significant amount or a significant share is actually held. So for example, Japan has a GDP of $4.2 trillion and they hold $1.1 trillion in US debt, and hence that represents about 26.1%. You see that, for example, China does have a large share in US debt, but it only represents 4.8% of their economy. Now, I would like to point out Luxembourg, that they hold about $318 billion of US debt, which corresponds to close to 390% of the GDP. Now, we have looked at the federal government, but of course there are also state and local governments. So here, just to give you an idea about how many local governments we have, and local and state governments we have in the United States. Now this is data from the 2017 Census of Governments conducted by the US Bureau of Census. And of course we have 50 state governments. We have about 20,000 municipal governments. We have about 17,000 town and township governments, and so on. Note that all of those governments, they have their own budgets, they have their own expenditures, and they also have their own receipts. Note that the census of governments is only conducted every 5 years, but I have compared the numbers between 2012 and 2017, and usually those numbers in terms of how many municipal governments there are is relatively stable over time. Now here I have taken Indiana as an example, where we have data about the real estate government tax collections. You can see that over time, the sales and gross receipt taxes between 1980 and the most recent year, 2021, that this has increased significantly from about $5 billion to $15 billion. The same is true for the individual income tax, where you can see that it went from about $2 billion all the way up to a little bit over 11 or 12 billion dollars. What is interesting here is that the corporation net income tax has been relatively stable over time. Now, let us have a look at other countries and how the US compares to other countries. And for this purpose, I have downloaded data from the World Development Indicators from the World Bank. And here in this graph, you see the tax revenue of the central government as a share of the GDP of the respective country. So you can see, for example, that the tax revenue of the United States compared to the GDP is relatively small in comparison to other countries, mostly European countries. If you're thinking about France, Greece, Sweden, or the UK. But you also have, for example, you have Australia and New Zealand that are collecting a significant share in tax revenue. Now the question is, how does the US compare in terms of central government debt? Again, this is in percent of GDP. And you can see that there are certain countries that have over 100% of their GDP in debt. Those countries include, for example, the United States as well as the United Kingdom. And of course, you also have other countries. For example, you have France, you have Greece, Singapore, or Spain. You can see that there are countries like, for example, Switzerland or the Russian Federation that have less than 25% in government debt as a share of GDP. Now, let us have a look at the course overview and where we are going through the topics that we are going to cover in the upcoming videos. First, we are going to have a look at the role of government in the economy. But note that before we do this, you will see there's a short video about real versus nominal prices and the time value of money. Okay, because it is very difficult, or we have to pay attention to compare dollar values through time. The video on the role of government in the economy is actually going to talk about market failures, basically why and how does the government intervene in the economy. Reasons for these interventions are, again, public goods. We are going to look at externalities as well as imperfect competition. Note here, and this is important, that public goods refer to a characteristic of the good, and it is not goods provided by the government. We will also see that the government is interested in economic stabilization, for example, low inflation rate or high employment, but there are also aspects of redistribution. Next, we are going to spend a lot of time on budgets. We are going to first look at what are called recurrent budgets. Recurrent budgets are done on an annual basis to match current receipts to current expenditures and services. We are going to have a look at government budgeting in terms of what is a budget cycle, what's the budget process, and how do governments prepare budgets. We are also going to look at the federal budget process. We're going to look at the various institutions and how budgets are evaluated. I mentioned before that there is a difference between mandatory spending and discretionary spending. There we are going to have a look at appropriation bills that are required for discretionary spending. Mandatory spending does not require appropriation bills. We are also going to look at budget methods and formats in this section. Now here, recurrent budgets, I would like to come back to matching current receipts and expenditures. This is in difference to what are called capital budgets, where you have a large expenditure at the beginning and then you have the services over time. So for example, you can think about infrastructure investment such as bridges or airports. Those have usually a very long lifetime of more than 1 year. That also means that if, for example, a bridge is purchased right now, then the bridge is going to lead to a service to the residents for say 30, 40 or more years. And hence it is important to have the expenditures associated with the bridge, that this is paid over time for people who are receiving the services. We are also going to look at cost-benefit analysis and a concept called net present value when we are going to look at capital budgeting. The next big topic is going to be government revenue. Here we are going to have various perspectives. There are going to be economic and political perspectives on government revenue. For example, where should money be spent on and how? We are going to look at various principles when it comes to taxation, in the sense that we are going to talk about efficiency, we are going to talk about equity, as well as adequacy, elasticity, and stability of tax revenue. So adequacy is, for example, that can the tax revenue actually cover the expenditures of the government, okay? Also, stability would, for example, refer to whether the tax revenue is stable over time. We are also going to look at the economics of taxation in the sense that we are going to look at what are called per unit taxes or lump sum taxes. We are also going to evaluate who is burdened by the tax, for example, based on income group. After those general principles of taxation, we are going to look at specific taxes. We are going to look at income taxes, which we have seen is the largest contributor to the federal budget. We are also going to look at taxes on goods and services, for example, sales taxes or fuel taxes. And we have to consider that those taxes on specific goods and services actually can influence the consumption of those taxed goods. For local funding, we are also going to look at property taxes, which of course is a very big source of revenue that can be spent on education and public safety. We are also going to look at other revenue sources that are, for example, fees or lotteries. We have mentioned before that if you are incurring a deficit over multiple years, that you are accumulating debt, which is basically the accumulation of deficits. Now, this debt has to be managed. There have to be forecasts, and we are going to look at the debt management and forecasting. This will involve looking at the mechanics of bond values. Basically, a bond, the issuer of a bond pays the holder of the bond interest and repays the principal at a specific date in the future, okay, which is usually called maturity date. We are going to look at the mechanics and how to value this bond. Now, in this course, we are going to use a lot of data from various sources. And if you have any questions about which sources I'm using or where you can obtain data, please feel free to ask me. Now, a great data source to start with for everything related to the federal government is the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office has, for example, publications on long-term budget outlooks of the federal government. So the most current outlook, for example, you can click on here and you have the CBO long-term budget analysis. Basically what the CBO is doing, it is looking at the federal revenue and expenditures given current policies and macroeconomic projections. There can also be significant discrepancies between the projections. For example, in the 2002 CBO projection, it said that the projected debt held by the public was projected to be 7.4%. Note that in 2023, or the first quarter in 2023, the debt was actually at 93%. The reason for this significant discrepancy between projection and reality is that we had tax cuts, we had spending on homeland security, we had the Great Recession, we had stimulus spending, and we also had COVID-19. So there are always factors or different macroeconomic environments that are influencing those projections. Other useful resources to obtain data is the Office of Management and Budget, which is associated with the White House. I'm going to use a lot of data from the Federal Reserve Economic Data, or the FRED database, which is maintained by the St. Louis Federal Reserve. There is, of course, also the US Census Bureau, as well as international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, or the World Bank. You can also have data from the European Union and the OECD. So here in those slides, I have included some links that can show you the data, that can give you data on like deficit, surplus, debt, and tax revenue.